It's budget season in my town, and what that means is we're set to hear, yet again, two eternal myths about the Board of Education side of the budget. And they go something like this. First myth. You can't keep cutting the budget. We're not going to be able to teach our kids. Second myth. We can't fire teachers. We want smaller class sizes. Don't you care about education? Don't you care about our kids? Won't somebody please think of the children?
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
So we're just going to breeze over the fact that in my town, the Board of Education side of the budget, in total and in terms of the line for salaries, has never decreased, and in fact has actually increased by over 30% since 2005, despite the fact that enrollment has declined by roughly 25% over the same period, and despite the fact that the Board of Education has had to shut down an entire school and hand it over to the town because of declining enrollment. Oh, and that happened to be the oldest and most expensive school to maintain by decades and by millions. Instead, we're just going to focus on the principle of the two myths. First myth. There is a strong positive correlation between public spending on public education and educational outcomes. So the more money you spend in taxes on education, the better you are able as a community to educate your children. Second myth. There is a strong negative correlation between class size and educational outcomes. So, the higher the student-to-teacher ratio in the classroom, the worse off the kids are, which means you want smaller class sizes without condition. Both of these myths are just that, myths, and I'll explain why this is the case. For the purposes of this video, when I refer to class size and education generally, I'm specifically referring to public education of kindergarten through 12th grade, because that's what the tax dollars in my town are tied to, and is probably, if you live in the United States, what your municipal tax dollars are tied to as well. The first myth is relatively easy to debunk, and we've known this for some time. According to the Coleman Report from 1966, commissioned by the National Center for Educational Statistics, quote, school-to-school variations from whatever source are much smaller than individual variations within the school at all grade levels. This means that most of the variation in achievement could not possibly be accounted for by the school differences, since most of it lies within the school, end quote. And that, quote, 70% of the variation in achievement is variation within the same student body, end quote. Further going on to say, quote, only about 10 to 20% of the total variation in achievement lies between different schools, end quote. But it doesn't stop there. Quote, the existence of variations among schools gives no indication of whether these differences are related to school factors, community differences in support of school achievement, or background differences. However, if these variations were largely a result of either school factors or community differences in support of school achievement, then the school-to-school differences would increase over the grades in school. However, this is not the case. There is no consistent increase for all groups in grades 1 through 6, and only a slight increase when an average of all groups is taken. Grade 1 is the crucial case here, because the tests were given shortly after the beginning of school, and thus school factors could have had little effect, nor could community factors outside the family have had much effect. Thus, the school-to-school component of test score variance at grade 1 is almost wholly a measure of the skills with which children in different schools begin school. This school-to-school component is already large at grade 1. Thus, the larger part of school-to-school variation in achievement appears to be not a consequence of effects of school variations at all, but of variations in family backgrounds of the entering student bodies, end quote. We'll come back to the implications of these results in a bit, but a specific lack of correlation between public spending and educational outcomes was further found in a 2014 Coulson Report commissioned by the Cato Institute, which suggested that, quote, the performance of 17-year-olds has been essentially stagnant across all subjects despite a near tripling of the inflation-adjusted cost of putting a child through the K-12 system, end quote. It further concluded that, quote, there has been essentially no correlation between what states have spent on education and their measured academic outcomes, end quote. It also contains pages and pages of graphs showing on a state-by-state basis the same trend in every single state of the union. Explosive growth in spending accompanied by no increase in performance. The 2016 Mackinac Report found the same thing when performing research specific to schools in Michigan. Quote, "The results suggest that there is only a very limited correlation between these two factors, spending and educational outcomes. Only 1 out of the 28 academic outputs analyzed showed a result that was a positive and statistically significant one, or different from 0, end quote, and further advised that, quote, it is unlikely that injecting new resources into Michigan's public school system, all else remaining equal, will make a meaningful difference in improving student achievement, end quote. Their conclusion was that, quote, there is no statistically significant correlation between how much money public schools in Michigan spend and how well students perform academically, end quote, and that, quote, this finding is consistent with what the bulk of the previous research has found, end quote. Not to be too cynical, but we can see that being played out in real life, in my district where these very myths are being purported. Here are how the 6 schools in my town have performed on standardized testing over the years. And again, as a reminder, spending has never once declined and has increased by 30% since 2005, despite a roughly 25% decline in enrollment. All of these and other reports seem to be heading towards 3 very important conclusions about public education, and there seems to be at least some agreement as to why all this is, but we'll come back to that in a moment, as we'll find that debunking the second myth points us in the same direction. As a reminder, the second myth is that there is a strong negative correlation between class sizes and educational outcomes. And for all intents and purposes, not only is this myth not true, in many cases, if there is a correlation, it's actually positive. According to a 2011 study conducted by the National Bureau of Economic Research, quote, class size is not correlated with school effectiveness, end quote. A 2015 study from Pearson, yes, the company that does all the standardized testing and prints a ton of your textbooks, and you would think would have a hand in pushing a left-leaning view on this matter, labeled the class size metric as, quote, a common distraction, end quote, and saying about class sizes and educational outcomes that, quote, there is little obvious relation, end quote, offering this graph to show the effect. Among the 200 kinds of educational interventions, the Pearson study ranked class size 147th, adding that, quote, almost all effects are greater than 0. Anything above 0 means that the program raised students' levels of learning. Perhaps all you need to enhance learning is a pulse. Their words, not mine, but it suggests that even if there is a very slight negative correlation between class sizes and educational outcomes, doing anything at all differently, no matter how facially idiotic, seems to have that effect, and thus, below a certain threshold, the actual course of action doesn't matter so much as the fact that something changed. The report goes on further to quote Andreas Schleicher to most succinctly make their point. Quote, if you have to choose between great teaching and a small class, go for the great teaching, end quote. It should be noted that both of these studies agree with the previous studies, too, that public spending on education is not correlated with educational outcomes, with the Pearson study saying that among countries like the United States, quote, it is hard to find evidence that more money makes much of a difference, end quote. For the effect in practice, we have to look no further than the same 6 schools in my district and their performance versus class size, where, if there is a correlation, it seems to be positive, not negative. So what do we make of all this? Well, there's still a few questions to be asked before we get to our big takeaway, the most obvious being why this is the case. I'm going to start with a conversation with NPR and Ava Moskowitz, who is the founder of the Success Charter Network, which NPR has described as, quote, a collective of 7 charter schools in Harlem and the Bronx, end quote. I won't read through the whole thing, but of all the reads I've linked to in this video, this, I think, is the most important because it most succinctly makes the point that by increasing class sizes, you can lay off the dead weight. And I frankly don't believe that in a school system that large, there isn't any. And use the cost savings to both offer raises and invest in other areas that actually matter, and by doing so, not only reduce costs on the whole, but also expose fewer students to the dead weight and more students to the best of the best. And it allows you to better retain the best of the best of the best by offering substantial raises. One of the listeners called in, herself a teacher in New York, who has also worked at charter schools, said the following about her experiences. Quote, I don't actually think that class size is nearly as important as the quality of the teacher. I think if schools are invested in supporting their teachers and creating highly managed classrooms that use effective classroom management, the class size is not nearly as important as the teachers understanding whatever they need to do to make kids successful. From my own classroom experience, I know that regardless of class size, once I felt like I knew my kids and knew what my kids needed, having a larger class actually allowed my kids to learn more about diverse experiences, about different books that they were reading. End quote. This is starting to get us down the path of what actually works, and why dumping money on this type of fire will not put it out, nor will reducing class sizes. Before we move on, however, we do have to make one caveat. There is a very limited place where class size can make a difference, and where the correlation is slightly negative, but all 5 of the following conditions have to be met before there is any correlation, and it still hasn't proved to be very large. 1. It only applies to kindergarten through 3rd grade. 2. It only applies when you can get class sizes below 18. 3. It only applies when you can get every class in K through 3 below 18. 4. It only applies when you control for aptitude, so mixing gifted kids and special needs kids in with everyone else kills these conditions. 5. It doesn't always apply because you have to control for student bodies and for teachers, so when you don't get at least like student bodies and teachers, the whole claim often falls to pieces. And all 5 of these conditions have to be met or the whole claim falls to pieces. Remove any one of these conditions, even when you can meet all of the rest, and the negative correlation vanishes, if it even existed in the first place. The reason I want to point out this caveat is because of the reason this caveat exists. It's not because teachers have to divide more of their attention with more kids. It's not because of variations in students' needs. It's not because of resource availability, because you have to control for that variable. And it's not even because of extra workload after hours. The only reason this is the case under these extremely specific conditions is because of, get this, physical proximity of the students to the teacher. Nothing else. And this is because the teachers are better able to physically observe disruptive behavior. Not because it modified their responses, not because of some improved conversion of sensation to perception, not because of some improved ability to recognize that the behavior was disruptive. No, it was pure sensation. You'd expect the same results from a teacher with a vision problem who so much as put on her glasses. And all of this is coming from the oft-cited Glass and Smith report from the late 1970s and the Project STAR studies coming from the middle 1980s that are so often used to make the opposite claim. Weston Kieschnick from Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt, yes, the left-leaning textbook publishing company, summarizes the conditions quite succinctly. Quote, class size doesn't matter because it changes teacher behaviors. Class size matters because it allows the teacher greater proximity to the students, end quote, and that when referring to reductions in class sizes under all these conditions, quote, what does change is student behavior. Why? Because it is simply more difficult for students to hide undesirable behaviors when there are fewer kids in the room, end quote. But why is this the case? Why is it that in the only circumstance in which there at least appears to be a negative correlation between class size and outcomes is purely a matter of proximity? Well, both of the reports we just mentioned, the conversation with Ms. Muskowitz, and even to some degree, the aforementioned reports on spending, indicate the same thing. Teachers do not change their teaching methods when conditions such as class size are changed. That means that the skill it takes to teach one kid effectively is the same skill it takes to teach 100 kids effectively. A great teacher of a subject is just a great teacher of a subject, period. Further, the only reports that suggest that class size can matter do so under the presumption that teachers have to change their methods, and as we know, as a rule, they don't. For further reading on all the caveats that need to be given for the various studies that claim there is a negative correlation between class size and educational outcomes, I recommend looking into the Ruggles Study from 2003, which is a meta-analysis of all the major reports up to that date that made such a claim. I'll put a link to that study in this video's description, but I should also point out that a number of those studies and related studies have since been met with mostly criticism for taking the stance that the negative correlation exists a priori. So what does have a strong correlation with educational outcomes? Well, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research study, the 5 most important things in a classroom are, quote, frequent teacher feedback, the use of data to guide instruction, high dosage tutoring, increased instructional time, and high expectations, end quote, and recommends, quote, a model emphasizing the provision of wraparound services, a model focused on teacher selection and retention, and the no excuses model of education, end quote. In a slightly more recent follow-up to the Pearson Study, author John Hattie listed, quote, collective teacher efficacy, end quote, basically the collective belief of a group of teachers in their ability to actually produce positive educational outcomes, as by far the best predictor within the classroom for positive educational outcomes, with, quote, cognitive task analysis, response to intervention, and teacher estimates of achievement distantly rounding out the top 4. It should also be noted that this study only included within-system effects and did not include external changes in its analysis. However, effort, deliberate practice, self-efficacy, strategy to integrate with prior knowledge, and, get this, prior ability, all referring to the students, all found themselves in the top 20, with prior ability coming in at number 9. All things that are probably largely influenced, at some level, more by what's going on outside the classroom than in it. And this is something we knew even in 1966, and which will bring us around to the major conclusions. Quote, studies of school achievement have consistently shown that variations in family background account for far more variation in school achievement than do variations in school characteristics, end quote. So here are the big 3 lessons about K through 12 education we have to learn, and if you get nothing else from this video, remember these 3 edicts. 1. The individual needs of students vary wildly from student to student. 2. The individual educational needs of the students far exceed the 4 walls of the classroom. And 3, the single best predictor for educational outcomes is parental involvement. For the record, this is why single motherhood so accurately predicts educational outcomes. So what can be done with a public school system strapped for cash? Well, to be optimistic, you can start by increasing your class size to whatever your facilities can reasonably handle, cut the dead weight, and use some of the cost savings to give the best of the best of the best substantial pay raises, because the quality of the teacher appears to matter a hell of a lot more than the number of students in their classroom. More systemically, you can take a more serious, hard-nosed approach to the classroom in general. This would be that no excuses approach everyone, even the 1966 Coleman Report, seems to agree with. That said, probably the biggest takeaway from all this is, well, the most cynical thing that could possibly be said. You'd be better off just writing checks to the parents to do with what they want than spending a dime in your system. And if you don't want the parents to blow that money on cigarettes and lottery tickets, then you don't write them checks. No, you, brief inhale, issue vouchers. Yes, this is the most cynical approach on the matter, but the point is that the more money going into the home, the more the parents are better able to involve themselves in their kids' education, and the better the educational outcome. Which also means that if reduced public spending is thus accompanied by a reduction in tax burden in the home, then you might actually expect a negative correlation between overall spending and educational outcomes. Also, since the educational needs of the students vary wildly from student to student, top-down approaches limit the tailoring of student education to a single system, where a bottom-up approach in which the parent makes all of the systemic decisions on an individualized basis actually addresses the problem. I'll also just briefly add that every single one of these reports, including a mountain of reports I did not cite, agree that the educational credentials of the teacher is a totally meaningless metric for predicting teaching performance, and that peer, student, and parent evaluations do a much better job of telling you how well a teacher has and will perform than any diploma, certification, or tenure will. And I guess I'll leave you with this. What we have looked at in terms of spending on education is overall spending, because that is what this whole conversation is about. And that is what most voters in the U.S. will be voting on when the time comes. And, of course, what we will be voting on in my hometown. And when that time comes, if your town doesn't have the money and is asking you if you're willing to spend less, will you make that decision based strictly on emotional appeal or upon the mountain of data and research that shows what actually works in a classroom and what doesn't?